Okay, so thank you all again for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today as we discuss this important topic. I have the honor of having Jayla Sylvester here with me. Jayla is a community organizer who has spent over 13 plus years working to address some of the disparities and barriers and challenges that LGBTQ plus individuals face, specifically around transgender individuals of color. Jayla has spent a lot of time focusing on addressing mental health, physical health, and other health needs of her community. She's currently based in Houston and continues to constantly learn and assist her community as we go forward. So this presentation will actually focus on some of the challenges that transgender people of color face when trying to access HIV prevention and care services. So thank you for joining us today, Jayla, and agreeing to do this presentation. And I'm going to pass it on to you to take over.
All righty. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for giving me some of your time today and some of your attention. I really, really appreciate it. So again, I am Jayla Sylvester. I am from Houston, born and raised. One of the things that I definitely just want to make clear is that I definitely believe in everybody's, in a community's innate ability to heal. Definitely from things that, there are things that communities face that, we can never go back and fix and rectify, but we can make different decisions today and move forward. And hopefully today, through this conversation, we have the ability to at least begin that conversation of what healing looks like for communities and what caring for a community really looks like. I am here representing Saving Our Sisters United. It is the brainchild and in part creation of Atlantis Narcisse, who is an amazing person in my life and a mentor, and has definitely been here for a lot of my formative years in the community. And so definitely being a part of this organization is not only helpful to me and other trans people of color, but it's also very personal. The organization's purpose of Saving Our Sisters is to create a safe space for trans people of color and for women as well to come together, to have conversation, and just to be there for one another. A lot of times in the community, there's not those safe places and those places to build community. And so we definitely saw a need and thus became Saving Our Sisters United. Although the name of the organization is Saving Our Sisters, we have actually advanced and grown out of that in the short time that we've been an organization. Now we have expanded to Saving Our Siblings and Brothers as well, which is so amazing to see, and to see the expansion of community and how we just have the ability to inspire one another to create, especially around the conversation of healing and building community. So slide one, I definitely want to take the time out to say thanks to Christopher. Thank you so much for this opportunity and for this conversation. I also want to say thanks to Achieving Together, the community plan to end the HIV epidemic in Texas. And what was unique and amazing is that last night I had the opportunity to go to the website, achievingtogethertexas.org. Under the About tab, there's a link for the Texas Transgender Alliance Resource Guide. And I thought that was amazing and that was beautiful because throughout the world, I believe it's around 60% of countries that do not even mention transgender as it relates to their plan to end the HIV epidemic. And so it's very important, and it does my heart well to see that here in Texas that we are lifting up that community, and that we are definitely focused in being holistic in the way that we approach HIV. Let's see. So I have notes here to the side. So if you see me looking off to the side, that's where I am looking. One of the things I believe in as I said earlier about holistic health, I believe that health and taking care of a community, and when we come to the thought of healing the community and inspiring and empowering the community, it has to be a wraparound situation. And so for me, holistic health approaches mental, physical, and spiritual health. Um, and so what I mean by that, of course, mental health and having services provided for the community, and also empowering communities to seek those services. When it comes to physical health, I'm not just talking about the physical body, but also thinking about economic health and things like that along that nature. Everything that affects the personal body space. And then also spiritual health, not just spiritual in the terms of religion, but spiritual in the terms of how are we taking care of the whole person, the heart, the soul of a person. And in doing so, also taking care of the heart and the soul of a community. So yeah, all right. So this presentation, what about us? Challenges faced by transgender people of color when accessing HIV and prevention care services. And so that, I think, is the best way to describe this presentation. That is what we're going to be talking about today, and specifically those challenges faced by transgender people of color. We'll go more into that in a little bit. I also want to say that throughout this presentation, I want to offer a trigger warning. There is pictures of trans people who have been murdered, sadly, throughout this year of 2019. And so definitely, if you know someone personally, they may pop up throughout this presentation. And so definitely feel free to take the time you need. And if you need to reach out, my email will be at the end of this presentation, and I will be here to facilitate that. So next slide. All right. So objectives. These are the things that we're going to talk about today. I know this seems like a lot of objectives, but I promise I will do my best to move us along and to also make sure I explain in a way for all of us to understand and get these concepts. For some of these concepts, they might be new. For some people, they might be old, but I want to present them in a way that hopefully challenges us to think about it in a more holistic way. So in the first point, what's the T? What's the T is just simply what I titled a Gender 101. So we're just going to go over a few definitions and why those things are important to the conversation. Why this presentation? I want to talk about intersectionality and how that affects our work and our advocacy. Challenges facing trans and gender nonconforming / gender non-binary people, especially as it relates to prevention and accessing and maintaining HIV and STI health. What can we do? That's going to be an ongoing conversation throughout this presentation, talking about those strategies and things that we can do to more holistically take care of the community and to do our work in an effective way, and to make sure that we are being mindful and intentional about our work. And we'll also talk about why this presentation is even important. And as you see to the side, we have Monica Diamond, who sadly was killed at the age of 34. Next slide, please. What's the T? All right. So what's the T? That phrase. It is a historical phrase. It is my attempt to invite all of you into the community. What's the T is, it's a rite of passage for me. Hearing that phrase reminds me of my introduction to the community and also my introduction to explore all of myself. What's the T is also an invitation to spill your truth. It is an invitation to also talk about gossip and things like that. It's an all-around phrase that just totally kind of wraps its arms around me. In this space, What's the T is also an invitation for all of you to hopefully feel like that this is a safe space, and to also feel free to ask any questions that you may have throughout the presentation. Well, I'm going to ask that you hold those to the end, but definitely feel free to have notes, have pen and paper, write down those questions throughout so that you can remember to ask them. All right, so let's get into the meat of this presentation. Gender binary. Gender binary is a spectrum between male and female. It's a linear situation. The thing I want to note about gender binary is that it is an antiquated sole thought of gender. What I mean by that is that it is problematic or that it has the potential to be problematic when it is centered around the belief that people can only exist as their assigned sex at birth. So there are two terms there that we should be paying attention to, that is gender binary and assigned sex at birth. Next, we have trans or transgender. You'll hear both terms throughout the community. And so trans can exist on the gender binary. So a trans person can identify as male or female. So just making that clear. And so in relation to the last comment about gender binary, is that when I say it's problematic, is that the ideal that for trans people, because we can quote unquote only identify as our assigned sex at birth, it erases whole identities of parts of the community. And so definitely being mindful about our work, we want to think about all of the aspects of the community and how can we be inclusive in terms of our jobs and healing and moving the community forward and empowering. And so the one thing I really definitely want to say along that is that the two phrases that come to mind: trans men are men, trans women are women. Also, this topic, it requires us to think out of the box as it relates to healthcare. Trans men may have vaginas, and that means that we have to rethink our terminology as it relates to healthcare. I've been in plenty of doctor offices where I have heard well woman's exam. And so rethinking about what that terminology can look like to be more inclusive. Also, I've seen how that also affects trans women. In my history, doctors have skirted around the fact that trans women may have penises and what that looks like for a trans person. There's always the thought in the process that for trans people, that for some odd reason that there is a dislike, or even in some aspects, I've seen people expect that there to be some hatred around the sexual organ. And so it can be an uncomfortable conversation for doctors. It can be an uncomfortable conversation that uncomfort is passed along to the community that they're trying to help or trying to take care of. It can also be an uncomfortable conversation when it comes to prevention work. I feel like that regardless of what's in that area, that if it's there, we have to have the ability to talk about it, and talk about it consciously and sensitively, but not asking questions out of just pure curiosity, but questions that are centered toward health and moving someone along the lines of better health. All right. So the last term on this slide is cisgender. Cisgender is a term to explain someone who identifies exclusively as their sex assigned at birth. The reason why this term is important is because a lot of times when people talk about gender, there's the conversation of someone's normal sex or normal gender versus trans, or someone's biological sex versus trans. And that type of language is excluding other identities, and also is saying that our gender is not natural or biological. It is also dismissive of people who are intersex as well. And so we definitely want to make sure that we are being mindful of language. And we'll talk more about language and why that's important in just a moment. All right, next slide. All right, so continuing this conversation of what's the T. So now we're talking about genderqueer, gender non-binary, gender non-conforming. These are all terms that can be used independently of each other. Um, for the term genderqueer, it is, in my experience, a more newer term that I see a lot of younger people are adopting as their identity. It can be problematic for some older people because of the term queer and what that has represented in communities, especially being a derogatory term for them. But there's been a reclamation of that word and a celebration of it and kind of taking back the power. And so you might run into that issue throughout the time. Um, Gender non-binary, gender non-conforming, I've seen those used a little bit more commonly to describe individuals. I cannot read the rest of the definition, but it's definitely there for you to read. But it's for people that exist outside of the gender non-binary. And what's important there is that it complicates the whole conversation of the gender binary and expands our thoughts on gender outside of that linear thought process. So the process of male or female, people existing totally out of that and not identifying as male or female, or not identifying totally as male or female. I believe that ideal is definitely more historically accurate. If we look back through history and through cultures from Africa or Europe or Asia, or even here in the Americas, we'll find many cultures that have believed in more than just this two gender binary of male and female. So examples of that would be the Hijra or the Mahu, things like that. So there's definitely historical evidence of um, our communities of trans and genderqueer, gender non-binary, gender non-conforming communities throughout history. In relation to the term transgender, um, we're talking about where it talks about gender expression. Gender expression can mean either in presentation, so the physical look of someone, they may choose to change their physical look to fit more concretely with who they are as a person. And or it may also represent, for me, the transformation that happens in what I call the heart space or the soul space of a person. Trans does not have a look. And so to better explain this process for me, I just want to share with you my coming out story and what that's looked like for me. Not all people have the same transition story. Not all of us were born into what we believe is a body that did not represent us or that we hated or things like that. That definitely was not my story. I was at the age of 30 and something unique happened. I had finally come into this realization that I am a Black gay man. I was out proud, living my life and totally enjoying it. Um, that all ended in the span of 1 week. One night in December during that year, I started experiencing dreams, these dreams of myself as a woman where I could see myself physically in my dream. And I was being referred to in feminine pronouns. And it was odd. It was weird for me. What wasn't unique was it being one night. Those dreams happened every night continually for a week. it was so persistent that I had to explore, what does this mean? Why am I having these dreams? What's going on with me? And so I started to research the term transgender. And in the research, I started to gain language and gain terminology to explain a lot of feelings that I have been having throughout my life, that I totally could not access those feelings because I didn't have language or words to even describe it. I didn't even know that being trans and what that really meant was possible for me because I had no language to describe it. So I just thought that what I was going through was normal, or that it was normal for a gay man. And with the language, it was freeing. The language was freedom. And eventually, from that revelation, I owned the fact that I am a trans woman, and I began my journey. Also, when we talk about transition, um, there's the thought that for transition, that means medically transitioning, taking medication, having surgeries, things of that nature, in order to physically transition the body. And that's totally not the case for everyone. There are people that do not seek medical transitioning or surgeries. They are perfectly comfortable in the bodies that they're in and expressing themselves. And that is perfectly valid, and it is totally okay. And so, because of that, the reason why that's important to our work is that if we have this pre-conceived notion of what transitioning looks like in our communities, if someone was to approach us and not fit into that box that we've created, then we may totally miss something that is vitally important to that person's health. We may miss that one conversation that they need in order to move their health forward because of the presentation. Um, I think that was the case for me throughout my 20s. I was saying that there was something different about me, but no one really understood. Back then, I presented very masculine and completely different than the way I do now. But in that process, even in my expressing that there was something different, it was oftentimes dismissed because of my presentation and because of my mannerisms and things like that. And so, because of that, that conversation never happened for me until I had the conversation with myself at the age of 30. Um, Pronouns. So, in addition to these pronouns, and the definition is there, in addition to those pronouns, you may run into other pronouns. So, we're having the conversation of language. The gift that I believe that trans and gender nonconforming communities have is that we have the ability to create language to describe ourselves and to totally expand this conversation of what gender looks like. And so you may run into pronouns like Z, like here, or zir. So that's spelled Z-E-H-I-R or Z-I-R. So I'm gonna leave that with y'all. That I'm from Texas, so we say y'all. I'm gonna leave that with you all so that you can research that on your own time and just totally get into that process of learning this new terminology. Again, that is Z, as in Z-E, here, H-I-R, or zir, Z-I-R. Also with pronouns, I have met a person throughout my life who has totally done away with all of those types of pronouns, and they simply want to be referred to as their name. So you may run into people like that also in the community, where they do not want to be referred as he, him, she, her, they, them. um, that person may want to only be referred to as their name, and their name is their pronoun. All right, slide 5. Yes, definitely, or someone that takes all pronouns. So you may see that as well. Um, so I know for sure during my process of transitioning, there was a point in time when I went by they, them pronouns, and I also went by she, her pronouns. And over time, I felt there was more congruence with my soul to just go by she, her pronouns, period. So you may see that transitioning of pronouns throughout someone's transition. They may go by he, him, um, and it may be only in certain circles that they go by those pronouns. They may transition to they, them pronouns, or go to the complete opposite end of the gender binary, and it may be she, her, or outside of that binary, and it may be they, them. And so for this, so we've been talking about language and how it is important. And so hopefully from that presentation, we get the sense of the importance of being sensitive to the community, of expanding our thoughts of gender and what that looks like for the community and not just for ourselves. And so again, talking about language, this thought of intersectionality. Going back to my presentation, all right. It is important that when we talk about intersectionality, and especially in relation to this presentation, we're talking about trans and gender nonconforming people of color. Intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, I believe it was in the 80s. You may have seen this word in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement, and it is related to that movement. But when she coined this term, it was because she studies case law. She's a law scholar, and there was a case where a Black woman faced discrimination, and she brought it to the courts, and the judge refused to see how being a Black woman created a unique situation for her and what discrimination looked like for her. And so what I mean by unique is, in that particular case, she applied for a job, and at this job, they hired Black men to do warehouse work and to do work related to machinery and things of that nature. And they hired white women to do work in relation to secretarial work and things like that. And so she applied for a job doing secretarial work, and she was discriminated against because of her not only her gender, because she could not get hired for any other work, but also because of the color of her skin. And so because of this intersection of these two communities that live inside of her body, of being Black and being a woman, it created this unique situation. And so why this is important to us and to our work is that if we think only in relation to how we take care of a community and how we empower a community through race or through gender or through economic health, things like that, if we don't address those intersections and the situations that they create, then we will leave whole parts of communities out of conversations. And I believe in part when we do our work, we will only be taking care of parts of people and not the whole person. And definitely in relation to HIV, I've seen throughout my time in doing the work is there's this push to take care of the whole client. There's the push we have to address it in all facets. So we think about the person's mental health. We think about the person's physical health and their medical health. We even think about their economic health, and we think about issues that they may face. And I've seen companies that provide bus cards and things like that so that people can not have barriers to getting to appointments and things like that. Even in relation to grocery cards, to make sure that people have the ability to access food. And so in thinking about that whole health, that holistic health, then when we think about intersectionality, combining the two in order to be a powerful force of good in the community. Next slide, please. So this is a physical representation of what intersectionality looks like. There is, when we're talking about language, the term disability. I personally do not like that word. I would prefer to say differently abled. That's just my preference, and I'm seeing it more and more in literature instead of saying disability. And so I talked earlier about Creme Brulee's story, and this here is a quote that she talked about, and in relation to some of the things I said earlier, in relation to the intersection of race, class, and gender, and how that shapes people's lives. And in my belief, like I said earlier, how it should shape our work, especially in relation to communities of color. Sure. All right, next slide, please. Challenges in HIV and STI prevention. So here we're talking about the lack of, in my thought process, of what those challenges look like. Lack of transgender and gender non-binary specific campaigns. Notice the word specific. Campaigns, programs, and interventions that build community, HIV education, and positive mental, physical, and spiritual health that centers people of color. I say specific because I've seen campaigns that have been created. And while there are some, I will admit that there are some campaigns that do center trans people of color. Oftentimes with campaigns, when we address those campaigns, there's the need to, when we approach these campaigns, it is from the LGBT standpoint, where we treat the community as a monolith. And that cannot be further from the truth. We say LGBT, but that is an acronym representing many communities and that are in that acronym. And so when we have campaigns that are for trans people that also include everybody else, while the message may be around equality or health or things like that, sometimes the message is diluted as it gets to trans people. Oftentimes we are equated and linked with gay men and with others in the community, and that can be problematic to us. In relation to, I've seen in the past, in relation to grants and funding for some of these things that I'm talking about, especially around programs and interventions, at different places and community centers, it would be around, yeah, we provide funding for Black gay men. There's no funding specific for trans people of color. And so, but they are included when we talk about men who have sex with men. And oftentimes those same programs and interventions, they either lack the capacity to adequately discuss issues of gender and how that affects race, specific to trans and gender non-binary people, or they totally just leave us out of the conversation, or what programs and interventions I haven't seen places that receive funding for men, what they call men who have sex with men, but programs that specifically address gay men of color. Rarely have I seen them address any issues related to trans or gender non-binary. It's extremely rare, and when it is extremely underfunded because most of the funding is dedicated to gay men of color. And so definitely thinking about that that's a conversation for organizations to have within, and what that looks like for the organization, and how can we fund programs and interventions and campaigns that center trans people and gender non-binary people of color, But also for those of us that do work in the political realm, that's conversations to have with government and what that looks like. And it just, I think about how even now, I've seen the erasure of trans to conversations around many of these topics. And it's just disheartening to see that that's happening in the community and even on a governmental level. And so it's even more vitally important that we do this work for our communities. Next slide, please. So now we're talking about accessing and maintaining HIV care. And so in this, the things I want to note is the limited education and sensitivity and representation amongst HIV professionals. That's one of the things. I believe it is important for the front of the house as well as the back of the house to be culturally sensitive and comfortable when speaking with and taking care of trans and gender nonconforming people. Here, I just want to highlight a story that I've ran into in my own life in relation to my own care. I've been to places where I've had a doctor who was overseeing my process, my medical transition, and really struggled around having the conversation of trans and things like that. And in relation to me, I had to tell him how basically to take care of me, what dosages I had been given in the past of, my hormones, and what that looked like for me. I had to explain to him my medical history, even though he had all of my lab work for the last year in front of him, things like that. But what was extremely disheartening was throughout my transition that I started at 30, there was a part in my life where I faced a lot of issues around support and feeling like I was doing this process all by myself. And I came to the conclusion of detransitioning. And so erasing this person that I had become and had totally owned Jayla, me, and I let that person go and went back to my former life, or what I thought I could pull together of my former life. And when I told my doctor that, he smiled. So this doctor had totally struggled with my transition and the process. When I told him that I was detransitioning, which was totally detrimental at that time and a really hard time, he smiled at that moment. It is that language, that body language that was communicated that, yeah, I was really hoping that you would have done this all along. And so oftentimes in relation to this point, I've seen presentations and trainings that center, like I said earlier, in relation to prevention, that centers the thought and the conversation of LGBT, but we don't go into specifics of those communities, and it's especially when we going into those conversations, into the specifics related to trans and gender nonconforming communities. And in relation to the conversation of intersectionality, we might, even if I've seen a training where we address the conversation of, we might talk about trans health, there may be one or two slides that focus primarily on trans health as it relates to trans people of color. And so in the relation of a conversation where there may be a training that lasts, let's say the conversation is about 30 minutes, there may be 5 minutes that are dedicated to trans people of color. This is the point that I want to highlight, is that these are some of the reasons why we need that intersectional approach to our work. When we think about the term of intersectionality, it requires us to be strategic about our work and also very methodical about our work as well. Something I want to highlight also a point in relation to this conversation is that globally, trans people are 49 times more likely to be HIV positive. And the thing, we having the conversation of language. And so we know that there's a shift from the conversation of someone being HIV positive to someone who is living with HIV. But in relation to our work and the call to action, there's a difference between someone who is living with HIV and someone who is surviving with HIV. That can be two different totally conversations. And so we want to move someone from a mindset of just pure survival and get them to a place where they are living and they are thriving and they are empowered. And so we have to be strategic in our work. And if we're going to move communities in that way, we have to, and especially communities of color, we have to think about intersectionality. And so I think I've covered the second point where I'm talking about intersectional challenges. Yeah, so we're gonna move along to the next slide. So here, did I miss a slide? Oh, no, I didn't miss a slide. I missed a point, but that's fine. So a part of that slide, the last slide, actually we can go back, just go back my slide. The part where we talk about and representation amongst HIV professionals. That phrase by itself created a very heated conversation between me and a close friend of mine. I feel like it is very important to have representation of trans people of color in relation to our work and in relation to the work of doing work related to trans people of color. What I mean by that is, I've seen interventions that have been created in the past, like Many Men, Many Voices, or places that implement the Empowerment Project. And it is very strategic, and oftentimes it is written as parts of grants where the staff must be representative of the community in which they are serving. Now, that is not only for just a strategic purpose, but I feel like, and definitely it was for me, and it was an invitation to the community to step up and to gain the empowerment, to gain the trainings, to gain the knowledge in order to heal their own, to heal their communities. Now, while we know that the work of taking care of a community cannot solely rest on the community, it's going to take many voices and many conversations from a vast array of people. But there's something unique and special about receiving care from someone that looks like you and that can understand, and that is not just culturally sensitive, but has walked the life. There's something different and unique and dare I even say spiritual about that. And so in relation to the conversation I had with my friend and it being heated, she said that, she said, sometimes if there are no people there to do the work, then there are just not people there. We can't require organizations or programs to do that work of empowering at least some people at first and giving them those trainings and the education needed to do the work. And I beg to differ. I know, although I had the passion and I had the background of working, well, actually not working in mental health, but I had my college education of learning about mental health and things like that. When a job opportunity opened for work, doing community work, at an organization, I applied, and it wasn't just because of whatever education I had, which at the time honestly was minimal. it was my passion that drove me into receiving the trainings that I needed, and began now this year, 13 years doing work in community building and things like that. And I call myself a community optimist. I believe the best for the community, and I want to see the best for our community. And so, in relation to those grants and hiring those people, a lot of those people that they hired didn't come to the work with the education. They gained it once they got into the position. They were hired because of their passion, or at least some beginning set of skills that can be grown over time. And so, in relation to the work of talking about programs and things like that, there has to be a place where we are inviting and doing the work of empowerment of trans and gender non-binary communities of color into doing the work. And that's not just the work. I know right now we're talking about HIV, but also talking about programs related to mental health and things like that. One of the things I didn't talk about was also the ideal of, in HIV, we have patient navigators that help people navigate, get into this whole new world of what it looks like for HIV care. When it comes to people who are dealing with gender and transitioning, we don't have that oftentimes. That's not a gender patient navigator to help you understand the terminology and all of this. That is vitally important because luckily I had people who were older than me in the life that told me, when you go to your doctor, you should come in with some knowledge. You should come in with some understanding of what is supposed to happen. A lot of times doctors are not trained or equipped to deal with gender care. And so I went in with that knowledge, and when doctors said certain things or they was not being holistic about my health, I could ask certain questions and challenge their thought and help them to see things in a different way, or point them somewhere where they can gain more knowledge in order to take care of me. All right. So the next slide. So throughout this presentation, we have seen pictures of people who have sadly been murdered, in part due to their identity, whether it be trans or gender non-binary. And for me, this is important to the work that we do. And this is the answer to the question of why we do this work. Why is this conversation important? Why is it important that we talk about intersectionality and we approach our work in that mindset and through that lens? Why it is important that we talk about intersectionality as it relates to prevention? Why it is important that we think about the whole person in relation to HIV care? And because of these pictures here are other people who have been murdered throughout this year. One of the things I want to highlight about 2019 is that in August of this year, we had already met the number of people that have been murdered last year in 2019. In this year of 2020, in August, we had already bypassed that number. And the year was not even up. In part, I believe this is due to COVID and things. It's talking about intersectionality, about being someone who faces issues in relation to gender, as it relates to race, as it relates to class, as it relates to being differently able, as it relates to economics. This work is important because our lives matter. Whether we're having a conversation of domestic violence and trans or gender nonconforming people, are we having the conversation of police violence, are in those communities? Are we having a conversation of inaccess to healthcare in those communities? When a client or someone walks into an organization or they sit in front of you, they're not bringing a part of themselves into that conversation. They're bringing their whole selves. And so in relation to our work, we have to think about that whole person. We have to begin to think about those conversations of how gender affects our work, and especially how gender in relation to race or relation to any of those different parts of intersectionality affects our work. Our names deserve to be said, but not just in death. Every year I see the movement to say their names, say her name, say his name, say their names. And sadly, sometimes it seems like the work that we do is always around talking about death and talking about, and there's always this push and this outcry that, hey, what about us? And so in thinking about that conversation and expanding that conversation, we have to also think about the living. We have to think about the people that are here in these lives, and we're not sitting around waiting for someone to die in order to be that catalyst for change. It shouldn't take death to be a catalyst for change. I believe that all of us approaches this work with some form of passion. There's a reason why we do this work, and oftentimes it's not because of the money. We do this work because we are drawn to it. We are called to it. It is important to us. And so because of that, that passion has to be that calling force to call us to approach our work differently. Next slide. The candles here represent not only the people that have passed away, but it also represents people that have passed away that are unknown, that we do not know their stories, we do not know their names. It also represents people that have been misgendered in death. And so there are definitely people out there that have faced these issues, and in the process of their death, families sometimes I have seen have totally not addressed that conversation, even in death of that person's gender. I have seen situations where trans people who live their lives as trans women in their death were buried as men. And that is, to me, extremely sad and unfortunate. So yeah. The life expectancy amongst white people in the US is the age 79. The life expectancy of the US period is age 79. The life expectancy of Black people in the US is 75. Amongst trans people of color and gender nonconforming people, the life expectancy is between the ages of 30 and 35. I just want to highlight the vast difference that is there. That for the life expectancy of the country to be nearly 80, and for the life expectancy of my community and my part of the LGBT, it's between 30 and 35. My fear is that this year I am 35. I have reached 35 this year, and in a few months I'll be 36. And I think about that conversation all the time of what that looks like, of having outlived my life expectancy. Throughout this presentation, the pictures that we have seen, it was important for me to highlight the ages because a lot of them were under the age of 35. A lot of them were under the age of 30. And that just highlights the work that we need to do, especially in relation to this community. Let's see. Next slide, please. Here listed for this slide, if you are on a computer, please take a moment to screenshot this page. And if you're on your phones, also please feel free to screenshot your page as well. Screenshot this page as well. On my end, I see there is a discrepancy in some of the resources, especially in relation to Trans Lifeline. But if you look it up online, you will definitely find the phone number. In relation to Trans Lifeline, it is a resource for trans people who are facing thoughts of suicide or are in crisis. And so it is definitely a resource to have. And there are many other resources that are there. Today I'm representing, in this moment, Saving Our Sisters United. That is the website. You can find us on Facebook at the moment, but there may be some changes to that in the future. The University of Wisconsin, some of the things I talked about today I pulled from that website. I found it to be really helpful and really informative. And so definitely if you have a moment, take the time to stop by and check it out. The Human Rights Campaign, HRC, I found many resources there. And also, if you want to check out some of the stories related to the trans people that were displayed in this presentation, and the gender nonconforming people that were displayed in this presentation, you can find their stories there on the website. Also, the Mahogany Project, I've worked with them many times in the past, an amazing organization. Avert.org was an amazing presentation as well. Avert.org had a lot of information around HIV, and especially HIV in relation to trans people and trans people of color on their website, and is information talking about it on a global level. And so definitely a great point of resource. The Houston I Am Life campaign, another amazing resource here in Houston that highlighted and in part trans and gender non-binary people and those communities of color. And HIV Houston, another amazing, the Transgender Ally Collective is a project that talks about trans people and their allies and what that looks like. And I believe there's works now to even expand that conversation of beyond just transgender, but also gender non-conforming communities as well. The True Project. The True Project is another amazing organization that has programming around mental health, but it approaches the conversation and that healing work differently. It approaches it through art. So a lot of times you will see conversations brought up, but it's brought up either through dance or poetry or paintings. And so another great place to check out. Also, the University of Houston LGBTQ Resource Center, another amazing resource. And also another that I'm thinking about now that didn't make it on the slide was also the Montrose Center as well. Another great and wonderful resource for the community. And I know that we have a lot of people here today, so definitely if you know of any other resources, please feel free to share them in the chat box. All right, so y'all, we're at the end. Next slide, please. This is my contact information. Again, I am Jayla Sylvester, and that is my email. It's my personal email, so you can feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'm usually up pretty late, so regardless of what time you send the email, I more than likely will get it immediately. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments that you may not want to share in this space right now. You can feel free to forward them to me personally, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jayla. So I do want to acknowledge we are at the end of our time, but we are going to keep going if folks want to stay on and ask any questions. I do understand if you have another meeting or something to go to. The call is being recorded and we're sharing it on our YouTube page. So please feel free to look at the link and see if there are any other responses to questions that you may have missed if you have to log off. But I do want to open it up now to folks. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts for Jayla while we have Jayla with us.
I am seeing the chat messages.
Donna, do you have a question? I think you're on mute.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
I was coming up the stairs.
No worries. Yeah, so there's a lot of comments coming in thanking Jayla for the presentation. I really appreciate how personal and emotional this presentation was, and sharing those images and names of the transgender individuals who were murdered throughout this year so far. 2020 has definitely been a very unique year with so many things happening, and it's important for us to make sure that we're not forgetting the communities that are often set aside, especially as we're seeing so many terrible things happening to everyone, and it affects all of us. And so thank you so much for showing this to us and making sure that we see who these people are and what their names are so that we don't forget. I do want to ask, so Jayla, you have experience working with a number of organizations and addressing needs of transgender individuals. Can you share some of the first steps that these organizations or recommendations that you give to these organizations on how they can better serve transgender individuals and non-gender or gender non-conforming individuals when you work with them and provide feedback?
Definitely. There's a push in organizations around diversity, and especially in relation to our programs. And so a lot of times when we have that conversation of diversity, we're talking about trans communities, and specifically trans Black women. But I dare to say we have to think even farther outside of the box in relation to what that looks like. And instead of just talking about just trans, but talking about gender as a whole and what that looks like. So not just trans Black women, but also trans Latinx women. Also trans men have to be a part of that conversation as well, but also not forgetting or neglecting our gender nonconforming community as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And I really wanted to kind of reiterate a piece that you mentioned earlier when we were talking about the umbrella of LGBTQ plus individuals. We often become fixated on the sexual orientation part or the sex part, especially when we're talking about HIV prevention and care. And it's important for us to realize that transgender individuals and gender nonconforming individuals, it is not about sexual orientation or sexual identity, it's about gender identity. And so we often have to remove ourselves from thinking about sexual behavior and understanding that even within the transgender and gender nonconforming kind of umbrella, there are a number of other sexual orientations and identities that are even a part of that. And so treating transgender individuals and gender nonconforming individuals as a monolith when we're looking at HIV prevention programming and care can really do us a disservice. And so we have to make sure that we're understanding that and approaching it with a kind of a curious outlook so that we see each individual as a person and not connecting them or thinking that because they identify as a trans woman, they therefore have these experiences and identify in a specific way, but understand that we need to see individuals as individuals, and have those conversations to get to know what barriers or challenges individuals may face. Do you have any other comments or thoughts on that piece, Jayla?
No, I think you said that perfectly. Definitely when it comes to the conversation of sexuality. So talking about intersectionality of sexual orientation and gender, it can look wildly different, but in many ways it can be relatively common to some people. A trans person can exist as heterosexual. Like I said earlier, trans men are men and trans women are women. And so in relation to the conversation of sexuality, we can definitely be heterosexual. We can be bisexual. We can even be pansexual. That's another term that's out there. So definitely do your research. And we can also be polyamorous. And so it's amazing. So the whole conversation of sexuality and gender, there's so much more out there, and we have come a long way. We have to stay on top of it, and the evolving conversation of what all of that looks like and how it plays a part intersectionally. And so definitely just approaching things through that lens and receiving as much information as possible.
And so we do have a question in the chat from Rhonda Andrew. She's asking, how are providers responding to receiving education on helping transgender people? Has it been positive or negative, and why? Are many universities requesting education?
So in relation to universities, I have seen a lot of universities now that are expanding that conversation. Recently, a few weeks ago, I did a panel discussion with Rice University in relation to femininity. And I think it was titled, Am I a Feminist? Was an amazing conversation, but I thought it was very unique and very powerful to include my voice in that conversation of what being a feminist means to the community, and especially in relation to trans and how that expands the conversation of gender and being a feminist. So I am seeing a lot of universities that are requesting this information. But again, the part that I'm often seeing in relation to organizations and to universities is that there is not the expansion of those conversations beyond trans. So not forgetting our gender nonconforming community or our gender non-binary community. And so I'm seeing that happen. And so in relation to diversity, just having a trans voice a part of a conversation is not the most diverse we can be. If we want a real holistic conversation, let's include everyone.
And then we're going to take the last question that came through on the chat before we end. Cordella is asking, are health insurance companies included in these conversations? Are you aware of that, or have you been a part of conversations that have included health insurance companies?
I personally have not seen those conversations between insurance companies where they are seeking the voices of the trans community and how they can better serve our communities, especially in relation to health insurance. I luckily have been able to be a part of health insurances that have provided care for trans people, but that care has looked completely different from company to company. More recently, in relation to intersectionality and this conversation, the health insurance I'm a part of now, they provide funding for my medications and things like that, but not in relation to the lab work required for trans people. And so in relation to hormone levels and things like that, they don't cover that. It's not a part of their purview. And so what happens is I get tagged with the bill of $250 plus whenever I do lab work, because those are not quote unquote necessary labs, but they are necessary to the trans and even some people who fall under gender nonconforming umbrella as well.
Awesome. So I want to thank you again, Jayla, for the very personal and powerful presentation that you've done. This was very informative, and I'm really pleased to have been able to connect with you and share this with folks. So again, if you do have any questions for Jayla, her contact information is on the screen. Feel free to write that down and send her an email. And thank you so much for taking the time and joining us for this conversation. I hope you have a great rest of your day and enjoy, have a good start to your week. So thank you all.